Fifth Executive Director of SPAR Council. You are at Springfield Preservation and Revitalization Speaker Series this year. Thank you for coming and following safe guidelines. We are going to continue this throughout the year, so please make sure for you to keep up with our events via our newsletter or our social media pages. And while you're here, and those that may be streaming with us, this is also kind of an all-call for you to maybe do a small donation to SPAR. As with any other nonprofit, of course, we are struggling because, like everyone else, we've had a lot of cancellation of our events, which is affecting us as an organization. And so if it's something that you feel called to do, we would love a donation, appreciation for you to donate, either here on the site, on our website, or through the Facebook donate button. So, welcome. I want to introduce you to Tim Gilmore. Just a minute. Just as a reminder, we do have beer, water, and seltzers and wine with your and then also Tim has some books available for purchase in the back. So feel free to get up, stretch your legs if you need to, go back and get some water. The restrooms are open downstairs on this side. And then just enjoy the evening. Thank you so much for coming. Tim Gilmore writes about the haunted South. He's the author of 19 books. Actually, I think he just said he hit up 20 now. This is his 20th book, including Stalking Ottis Toole, a Southern Gothic. Gilmore's the founder of Jacks by Jacks, a literary arts festival, and the writer and creator of Jacks Psychoteam. Correct. Gilmore teaches literature and writing at FSCJ, where he was awarded the 2018 Distinguished Faculty Award. Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville named Gilmore the 2018 Literary Artist of the Year. He holds a PhD in English from the University of Florida. We are super excited to have Tim Gilmore here tonight. Thank you. Okay. Should I have this one off?
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out in the midst of, the bubonic plague and a Jacksonville summer. It's only like 105 degrees or something like that. I'm really grateful that you're here, and thanks to Jean and to Kelly from SPAR for putting this on. Can we give them a round of applause, please? So, it's been a surprise to me that Springfield is as, interested in Ottis Toole as they are. When I first wrote Stalking Ottis Toole, a Southern Gothic, in 2013, I was a little bit afraid. I love Springfield so much, but this is not the same neighborhood, or at least it's not in the same shape it was in the time that Ottis Toole lived here. And so I expected some pushback, and I'm sure there were some feelings of that, but I never really received it. I've always been grateful for that. The new book that I'll be reading small parts of, A Story to Be From, it's called, and sadly you probably all recognize this title from the news. It's called Murder Capital, 8 stories of 1890s to 1980s. And actually the 1890s story is also set in Springfield. And a couple of the other stories touch down in Springfield as well. And for reasons that I hope will seem obvious pretty soon, I reworked the perspective that I wrote in Stalking Ottis Toole, a Southern Gothic in 2013 into one of the 8 stories in this book, which is called Framing Ottis Toole, a Southern Gothic. I think that you'll see why tonight. Real quickly, I want to read to you what the back of the book says. It says, for more than a century, Jacksonville has stood out nationally for its murder rates. Headlines call the city Florida's murder capital. The 8 stories in this book tell of Cuban revolutionaries, little-known serial killers, and a phony serial killer, of a man who courted and murdered mother-daughter pairs, of lynchings and Southern good boy corruption, of satanic panic, it's actually a sociological term, of a white supremacist killer with a black male lover. These stories each stand on their own, even as they interrogate the long, violent history of Florida, the Deep South, and the city where those two entities most thoroughly intersect. So, what I'm going to do is scroll through a few slides that I have for you and read a few short pieces from the story, one of 8 stories in this book. And that story is Reigning Ottis Toole, a Southern Gothic. And I think that those things will be self-explanatory. When I wrote my book, Stalking Ottis Toole, Southern Gothic, in 2013, what most fascinated me about Toole was how many versions of him there were and how someone so completely lacking in intelligence and social skills could have managed to fool so many people. So I set out to write the book by way of bouncing all these tools off one another. Many of the responses surprised me. Some readers seem to finish the book and still think Toole was one of the worst serial killers in history. That reaction puzzled me. But I'm aware, Ray, the French theorist Roland Barthes, that once you put your work out into the world, it lives in your stead. The author is dead. I had reanimated Ottis Toole, and I couldn't follow him with disclaimers and explanations wherever he went. I stand by Stalking Ottis Toole. It's thoroughly researched, discordant, perhaps too complicated, but Ottis continued to haunt me. As I researched and wrote stories set in and around downtown, Ottis made regular appearances. Clearly, he'd set ablaze the old Drew building on Bay Street. His so-called death car and supposed murder weapons parked themselves in news stories I wrote about the Victorian neighborhood called Springfield. Whenever stories moved through the late 1970s and early 80s, I could count on Ottis to show up. He kept following me. And then I found my fingertips once again typing his name. This time, the title refers not to my stalking him, but to what everyone else had done. When I adapted Stalking Ottis Toole for the stage in 2017 for Florida State College in Jacksonville's Drama Works, director Kim McCullough came up with the idea of splitting Ottis into 3 characters. It worked, I thought, brilliantly. Ottis became not the dozens of possibilities he may have been in my book, but Ottis the killer, Ottis the mama's boy, and Ottis the subservient lover. Frequently, Ottis longed desperately enough for his mother that he imagined she interacted with him after she died, and after, for the second time, he burned her house to ashes. His relationship with his sister Drusilla, whether or not her November 1981 overdose 6 months after their mother's death or suicide, was both more complicated and less. Ottis said he looked after Becky the best he could. Hadn't he done almost as well as Drusilla? Ottis looked after Becky, and Henry had her living in a chicken coop. Ottis was there when Henry married her, though whether Ottis knew the marriage was illegal, he couldn't say. Becky was 13 years old. Henry was in his 40s. It was Drusilla who used to dress Ottis in Philly dresses when he was little. Angel, Drusilla called Becky. It was Henry started calling her Becky. Drew had named her Frida, but she always called her Angel. Ottis knew Becky was living in a chicken. He knew the things Henry had done to her. Most things he didn't know if he killed her. He thought Becky was dead, and if Becky was dead, it was Henry. Killed her at the truck stop in Texas, outside the house of prayer. Summer of 1982, the city fire marshal and fire prevention bureau investigators walked the southeast quadrant of Springfield, east 2nd and 4th and 5th Streets, Hubbard and Market and Liberty Streets, sticking handbills to doors, placing them in residents' hands. Arson Epidemic, the flyers announced. One morning in early June, firefighters placed 400 notices on Springfield doors in an hour and a half. There have been numerous arson fires in our neighborhood, the flyers said. The arsonist has been using readily available combustibles found in or near the buildings he set on fire. No one knew the number of fires he set in the last 2 years, but 10 beautiful old homes in decay have been set ablaze in the last 2 months. Springfield's fire station number 2 on North Main Street, the oldest active firehouse in the city, is taking more than 100 calls a month. Max Call's 1985 book, Hand of Death, the Henry Lee Lucas story. Ottis Toole is a sharp, wily, sophisticated, and secret agent for the devil. Now long out of print, blatantly absurd, Call's book helped form the great myth of Ottis and Henry as the most evil and prolific killers ever, perhaps in all of human history, easily outwitting the greatest minds in law enforcement. It's written so poorly, it's astonishing anyone took it seriously, but as late as Les Stanford's and Joe Matthews' 2011 book, Bringing Adam Home, The Abduction That Changed America, prominent writers and well-known homicide detectives purported to believe every stupid line. The book depicts Ottis introducing himself to Henry, saying, "I'm Ottis Toole. I've noticed you working, and you seem to be a loner. It's Friday, and I was wondering if you'd like to join me for a night on the town." Max Call introduces himself personally to the reader, attesting to devil worship camps in the Everglades in the 1970s and 80s. He introduces Ottis as a satanic agent, an insider connected to wealthy and powerful people. It was Ottis, Call writes, who indoctrinated Henry to devil worship, telling him Satanism, quote, gives us the power to do anything we want as long as we obey the master. Until his initiation, Call writes, Henry assumed Ottis's cannibalism is, quote, simply something all homosexuals enjoy. When Henry admitted, Call writes, that he killed Ottis's niece, Becky, Ottis said, "The problem, we use her body to celebrate the Black Mass," he supposedly said. So, it's a couple of photographs of Ottis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas, including, of course, this photograph where Henry charmingly wears a Jesus t-shirt. And Ottis wears a t-shirt for Happy Jack's Lounge, which was a bar at Jack's Beach back in the day. Anybody who went there? Testimony? So hey, Henry, you know I do, Henry. I still think about you all the time. Ottis was in prison in Florida, Henry in Texas, when authorities arranged and recorded the phone call. Ottis mooned over Henry. I just love Henry, he'd say. I got your picture right here in my cell. Ottis said on the phone, it's right here with me, Henry. I look at it all the time. I just think about you all the time. And then so sweetly he added, how many people did you kill, Henry? And Henry said slowly, I'd say, as though doing complicated math in his head, 150. Between 150 and 160. Ottis, like a little boy seeking approval, said, I was with you on some of them myself, wasn't I? And sweetly, liltingly, Ottis repeated, well, I still think about you, Henry. I got your picture right here in my cell. When Henry said, now, I won't rest. I won't rest until I know who's involved. Ottis, desperate for love and approval, appreciation, said, I'm involved with you, Henry. You know I'm involved in it. I'm involved all the way with you, Henry. Sometimes Ottis looked up at the ceiling and wagged his head back and forth on his neck. It was an almost automatic movement, self-comforting. Other times his mouth fell open as he stared forward, and then he sucked on his slightly protruding top front teeth. When he promised Henry he was involved all the way, Henry said, I want to know that. Well, Henry, you know it, because I'm telling you. And then, trying to impress Henry, Ottis said, you know I was doing a lot of that killing way before I met you, Henry. Whenever Ottis tried to impress him to win Henry's approval, Henry mistook it as competition. It was part of their dynamic. So, of course, Henry said, yeah, I know that. I done a lot of killing and other things before I met you, too. Henry was competitive, but Ottis just needed Henry's love. So when Henry took Ottis' need to impress him as a contest, Ottis responded to Henry's competitive declaration with nurturing care. So Ottis said, well, Henry, I don't care what you've done. I still care about you. I still care about you either way it goes. Then there was that rare instance, the two of them together on the other side of the table being interviewed. Next to Henry, Ottis is a giant. He wears a sweatshirt, sleeves rolled up, a scruffy beard. At first, Henry's smoking a cigarette. Nonchalant. Ottis smiling bright and big, head turned to Henry, wholly absorbed in him. By this point, Ottis has his new teeth and smiles big with them. In love, throws his head back on his neck, happy. And something shifts between them. Henry takes a puff and looks down, and Ottis swings his great big head back toward him, puzzled and suddenly saddened. Then Henry wipes away a tear, and Ottis moves in. Ottis leans forward, his mouth hanging open, and sweetly wipes one big bare paw over Henry's eye. He rubs his fingertips over the eye, his mouth hangs open. He wipes his hand across Henry's face. Beneath Ottis' giant hand, Henry's hand wipes an eye. Ottis rubs his fingers over Henry's face, completely covering it, and Henry sobs. Ottis leans toward him. All the rest of the world for Ottis and all of time as it comforts Henry has ceased to exist. Ottis' forearm is huge and hairy. Henry's face vanishes behind Ottis' great, big, sweet, dumb, loving, blind hand. You could not make up the kinds of stories Ottis told. Anyone who could tell such stories had done the deeds, so said the Jacksonville police detective. Besides, he said, Ottis Toole was a known homosexual. Ottis was homosexual, the detective repeated. If you saw someone who looked like Ottis Toole walking down your street, you could call the police. Ottis, the detective said, liked to burn down buildings and was homosexual. He and Henry were manipulating the system so they could live together, quote, homosexual lovers in jail. Eddie Buquo saw Ottis walking down Main Street all the time. He stopped to offer him a ride down to the city rescue mission. Buquo laughed when people asked him about Ottis. I always just thought he was a local nut, he'd say. Sometimes Buquo rolled his eyes playfully, sometimes he smirked. Buquo, a Springfield hairdresser, owned Powder Puff Beauty Salon on Adams Street downtown. Ottis never frightened him. For the longest time, Eddie didn't even know Ottis' name. He'd heard his name as Alice, so that's what he called him. Ottis never directed him. The first time Eddie saw Ottis, he remembered it well. 1974 or so. Confederate Park at Springfield's border with downtown to the south. Lewd and lascivious behavior would be the charge. It was dark, late at night, when Eddie saw this tall, awkward clown come prancing toward him with not one stitch of clothing on. Alice was carrying all his clothes over his shoulder. Alice came straight at Eddie, introducing himself. Then he walked naked through Confederate Park, straight to police officers waiting for him. Eddie Buquo smirked and hunched up his shoulders. Alice Toole went to jail, Eddie said, wearing nothing at all. So here's a question. Of whether, maybe it's an honest phone. Did anybody else hear the phone ring? Of whether Ottis Toole was the worst killer in Florida history or the most successful solver of Florida crimes. Fred Grimm is the writer's real name. That irony aside, the Miami Herald columnist wrote, Ottis Toole was the ultimate crime buster. He solved some 160 murders in Florida alone, including the state's most notorious murder mystery, the killing of little Adam Walsh. By now, I've used sarcasm often enough to realize how many readers and listeners don't recognize it. What seemed so obviously Grimm's point was clearly lost on readers who read Ottis was the mastermind murderer of hundreds of victims, a Hannibal Lecter or Vlad the Impaler floating casually across the North American continent and spit roasting children. Toole's crime-solving technique was to confess, Grimm wrote. The half-wit pyromaniac freely confessed to nearly any old homicide languishing in police files. It was a great deal for everyone involved. Detectives across the state cleared their old files, appeased their bosses, and we in the media got to employ some wonderful hyperbole. Toole, after his confession frenzy, became, quote, the most prolific mass murderer in Florida history. The only mystery left unsolved, Graham wrote, was how any cop without supporting evidence could have believed Ottis Toole. And so that earlier photo is an AP photo of when Ottis was on trial for actually the killing of George Sonnenberg, who died in the East 2nd Street house, which we'll see a photo of in just a minute. Probably several of you know. And the other photo is one of the last photos of Ottis Toole before he died in prison of cirrhosis. So, supposedly Ottis Toole killed hundreds of people. The only killing really to kind of snag in history is the murder of Adam Walsh, son of John Walsh, who later hosted Unsolved Mysteries. This is a photo of a poster for the movie about Adam, and he'd gone missing, which, by the way, Ottis Toole watched in his jail cell the night before he confessed. In the middle is the Miami Herald front page story, who really killed Adam Walsh. There is compelling and interesting evidence that actually Jeffrey Dahmer was in South Florida at the time, and there's a whole wormhole you can go down if you want to question whether Jeffrey Dahmer killed Adam Walsh. The upper photo on the other side, these 6 charming-looking individuals were men collected off the streets of Springfield at the time, and 4 line up, and there's Ottis in the middle and the bottom, and the bottom photo on that side is how the Hollywood Police Department. I didn't know before I started this research that this was possible, that the Hollywood Police Department, long after Ottis Toole was dead, declared the Adam Walsh case closed and Ottis Toole the killer without any kind of trial or anything. It's something called exceptional clearance, which still kind of blows my mind back in that. Anyway, so that's those photos. In some videotaped confessions, Ottis looks dazed, sounds incoherent. He seems drugged, though he's been in prison. Frequently, he wags his head back and forth and stares at the ceiling. It's something that drove interrogators mad. Sometimes they'd halt interviews to tell him to stop wagging his head around, to look them in the eyes. He contradicts himself repeatedly. Minutes. When asked to explain what he's just said, he has no idea what he's uttered or what's being asked. But if an interrogator asks, like what happened in Maryland, he says, oh yeah, then waits to hear what happened. Other times, Ottis just talked and talked. You could see his face light up with pride, and things kept occurring to him to say. Always he mirrored his questioner. He developed an uncanny skill to tell what others wanted to hear. Urgency in his interviewer's voice found urgency in his. If you wanted to be sickened, he'd sicken you. If you wanted to know why he killed 3 people, he'd kill 120. If killing wasn't enough, he'd hurt people. Wanted to hear he'd worship the devil. People liked cannibalism, they liked Satanism, they liked hearing about children being hurt, they liked necrophilia. He'd heard about things people said, so he said things people wanted to hear. It was, perhaps, the only thing he was good at, the only skill he really had. Boys and girls taste about the same, he said in one celebrated interview. When you roast them, 8 to 10 years old, the flavor is a shade different when they're teenagers. The boys are gamier than the girls. He smiled, his eyes soaked up approval, and he said, "Give me the roasted meat of a boy age 14 and a girl age 14, and I can tell the difference even when you use a spicy sauce." The editorial Graham wrote in 1996 upon Ottis' death from cirrhosis in prison. He recalled 1983 interviews when Ottis had only as yet claimed responsibility for 65 murders in the Sunshine State. The law enforcement agencies at one point believed Ottis, with Henry, responsible for about 600 murders. The only case to have caught hold in history is the murder of Adam Walsh. Grimm notes that Ottis first confessed he killed Adam with Henry. Eventually, Ottis had to acknowledge Henry was in jail in Maryland at the time and said he wanted to get back at Henry for having run off with Becky, that Ottis missed his niece. As Grimm wrote, Ottis had every detail about Adam Walsh wrong. The clothes were wrong, the age was wrong, the hair was wrong. Toole was unable to identify Adam's photograph. Grimm reminded his readers that Jacksonville police detective buddy Terry had told Ottis the two of them might write a book together, make money off Ottis' story, maybe even get a movie deal. Ottis told Terry so much the detective wanted to hear, then Terry was removed from the case. Finally, Fred Grimm writes, Ottis' former defense attorney said he couldn't believe a word Ottis said. Ottis and Henry had upped each other's ante back and forth in prison cells in Texas and Florida, clearly, if often cluelessly competitive. 1985, says Grimm, the Dallas Times-Herald noticed that Lucas would have had to have been in several locations simultaneously on his killing spree. One Dallas Times-Herald headline asked, mass murder or mass hoax? Grimm ended his editorial by saying, Ottis Toole's ghastly lies do nothing to shed light on the enduring mystery of little Adam Walsh. Law enforcement workers' fixation on Toole meant that whoever killed Adam Walsh got away with it. So lots of you know this particular house, right? On 2nd Street. It's a gorgeous house. And here's what happened here. What sent Ottis Toole to jail in the first place, and then prison. It was a ramshackle room, a boarding house, 2nd floor, walls stripped of plaster, bare furnishings, a sad, sodden bed, a crooked wooden table. This young couple, Regina and David, had just married. We were very young, Regina Hersey says. This neighborhood called Springfield was, the early 1980s, very rough place. David and I wanted to marry, and our families wanted us to wait. So we escaped to the only place we can think of where our families would not find us. We ran away from our affluent Fernandina Beach households. We hid in the heart of Jacksonville. They felt the heat. They saw the smoke moving into the room from beneath the door. David ran to the door, opened it, and smoke poured in. The house is on fire, and shouted, "They'd have to go out the window." She couldn't do it, she said. And she'd have to do it, he said. They'd have to jump. She pressed her feet together and bent her knees. The house was going to burn down, and no one was going to get there in time. David would jump. Regina would jump. David would try to catch her. David was a wise young man, Regina says. We eloped into the situation. He seemed to understand how things should play out. He did exactly what he told me to do. We were barefoot, and he jumped, and he landed. But I was in shock. I found it very hard to do anything. I couldn't imagine what was happening or why it was happening. Now, David was on the ground, calling up to me and telling me to jump. Now Regina was alone in the room, the fire coming on. She was frozen, could not move. David shouted up to her. She would have to jump. The house was burning down. No one was coming. So I jumped, Regina says. I jumped backward. It's the way you might jump clumsily off a diving board, and it didn't work out. I landed on my lower back. The crowd had gathered there on East 2nd Street. I later heard that Ottis Toole was standing right there on the sidewalk, watching that tall house burn. I broke my back in that fall. My doctor said I'd never walk again, but I did. I do. I later heard so many stories. I heard Ottis and Henry were both in that boarding house where my teenage husband and I were hiding from our parents, having naively eloped. I heard Ottis was targeting Henry because Henry had killed Ottis' niece. Then again, I also heard Ottis set at least 24 old houses on fire in Springfield for sheer pleasure. That same night, firefighters put out 2 other blazes in old Springfield houses, and the fire that nearly destroyed the 3-story Drew building built in 1901 downtown on Bay Street. Later in prison, Ottis would tell an interviewer, "I'd like to see a whole city burn down. I'd like to see a whole city. I'd like to see the tallest building burn down." From what I later learned, Gene says, Ottis Toole set a great deal of Jacksonville on fire that same week. Ottis looks directly into the interviewer's eyes, languidly, doltishly, his big knobby shoulders slung over his chest. He's gained 40 or 50 pounds in prison. This is the Ottis on this side, which is from a terrible documentary from the late 80s called Death Diploma. The middle, which is also really blurry, is one of the last photographs of Ottis Toole with his niece, Sarah Christine, who had been a prostitute in Jacksonville, mostly in Springfield. And that other blurry black and white photograph is from the early 1980s, from when fire department officials were putting flyers around Springfield warning about the arson epidemic. In future interviews, he'll wear dentures. In the older interviews, his teeth look rotten. The large gap front and center of this interview, if he has teeth, they can't be seen. He slurs and slowly maunders. His first job, as the interviewer asks, street hustler. He was young then, very young. He went mostly with older men. Sometimes he wore dresses when he walked up and down Main Street. So the interviewer asks him, "How did you get started hustling?" Childishly, candid, Ottis answers, "This is not the Ottis who loved attention from making up stories, bragging about satanic rituals in which he said he had sex with goats and children of shish kebabs with spicy sauce. No, this Ottis, guileless and toothless, eyes wide open, says, when I was about not quite 6 years old, my father's friend forced me into it. The interviewer's brash, shows no sensitivity, no grace whatsoever, says, "What did he do to you, Ottis?" "Well," says Ottis, he made me had all kinds of different sex with him." The interviewer knows his viewers want to burn witches, not sympathize with perverts who, in letting themselves be victimized or complicit in anything anyone did to them. Didn't Ottis tell the adults what was happening? And if not, why not? Even still, his soft shoulders bear the burden of proof. Told my parents, Ottis says, but they said, I don't think he would do anything like that, because he took all the kids to the picture show all the time, took them to the beach and what have you. So does Ottis remember the man's name? "Yeah," he says. "The little boy whose frame we went to a man's." And Ottis says simply, "Chris." It was Chris that, Ottis had said, in addition to his father, if you were a killer, you'd have killed. The interviewer, criminally and stupidly, fails to ask anything else about Chris. Whoever Chris was, his first name's nailed here in this story, here on this page, but shamefully, criminally, since every adult in Ottis Toole's childhood failed him, since every adult continued to fail him in his adulthood, we have nothing else. How often, the interviewer asks, did Chris do these things to Ottis? Well, Ottis says after about a dozen times, he got used to it. And that's the clearest and truest statement of any most reprehensible crime involving Ottis Toole. The newspapers say that between you and Henry Lee Lucas, responsible for close to 700 murders. What do you have to say about that? Ottis, shoulders slumped, smiling widely, ridiculously, answers his interviewer, "I ain't even done one, how am I going to do 700? So his interviewer asks him what sent him to jail and then to prison. "I got put in jail for burning down a couple buildings. You're what they call, you used the word before, closing his eyes, leaning his head back, smiling from ear to ear. Ottis says, powerful maniac." And as the interviewer smirks, repeats with emphasis, powerful maniac. That's right. I think the word is pyromaniac. And this is supposedly the so-called Ottis Toole death car. Ottis drove lots of cars that he and others purchased at this place in the middle, which is right around the corner from us, and was Spence Auto Sales once upon a time on Main Street. Ottis never had a driver's license that couldn't pass a test because he was really all but totally illiterate, which is a whole other section in the story. So there's more to the story than I'm reading. Being asked about cannibalism and necrophilia made Ottis laugh. We threw in the filth and said, filth is what makes the book sell. They say I eat people, but I fuck the dead. Ottis played everybody. So much for everybody calling him stupid. Ottis was stupid, but a lot of powerful people turned out to be more stupid by far. He was carrying all of them in a wild goose chase, seeing how much money we could get from the spin on it in all the states. You guys did play with the system, the Germans said. We had the whole United States in an uproar, Ottis said. It was the biggest uproar in history. The interviewer points out the scars on Ottis' hands and asks about them. Ottis says those are the places where he held cigarettes to his skin to burn himself. The interviewer asks him, what can you do? You got out of jail, Ottis. Ottis says, go right back to Jacksonville. Do what, Ottis? Ottis says, simply, get me a job. You give up the torch, huh? And his toothless mouth smiling wide and big and happy and sad, Ottis says slowly, sweetly, innocently, ain't gonna say I would burn down no more buildings. Thanks. I hope that wasn't too long. I know it's hot.
It is hot, but that's okay. What an interesting subject. Oh my goodness, there's so many things I want to go back and Google and look more into it and stuff. Tim, thank you so much for your time. Or I could find a book, exactly, which are available for purchase right there. So feel free to go by. We are going to go ahead and end the session right now. Thank you for putting in your time and sweating with us and enjoying tonight. Please feel free, like I said, to drop a couple dollars into our donation jar. We would certainly appreciate it. And then also stop by and talk to Tim and maybe purchase a book afterwards. Please feel free to continue to follow and support SPAR in Springfield. We're thankful to have you all and I hope you enjoy your night.